Get started. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your day. For those of you who did last night, thank you again for signing in and listening to our presentation. Tonight will be considerably shorter than last night. We covered a lot of ground. Um, Not quite so much material here. Not nearly as much material here tonight. So, welcome to our presentation of school tours, what to ask the admissions counselor in regard to sexual assault and things like that on campus. The perspective, and for those of you who have just joined, if you would just sign in, tell us who you are, where you're from, and whether you're a parent or an advocate or so forth, that would be great. Give me an idea of who we're talking to. But our focus obviously is a parent, and a parent who is in a position where they have a youngster who is getting ready to go to college, right? So maybe they're a junior, rising senior, a senior, trying to make some decisions in terms of what school they want to go to and so forth. So I am a parent of a survivor who was sexually assaulted in 2014. I am married, have three daughters, and the youngest daughter at the time of my middle daughter's sexual assault was a junior in high school. So as my daughter returned to campus in the fall of 2014, my youngest daughter, Maureen, was just starting her senior year in college. So that kind of gives you the background and gives you some of my thinking that went into this this presentation. So if we go and look at the next slide, I'm, as I said, Kevin Marr, and one of the founders of an organization called Parents Take Action to End Rape on Campus. And if that name sounds familiar, it is. We are or were inspired by End Rape on Campus. So we, with their permission, borrowed their name a little bit. But we are an independent organization focused on parents. So on the slide there, it kind of gives our mission statement. We're here to support parents and guardians whose children have experienced school sexual violence by sharing our knowledge, experience, and information with others. So that is our background. That is our focus. Pretty much we deal one-on-one, individual outreach with individual parents who call us or get in touch with us through our website. And we also do some, this is a little bit new for us, but we've had it on kind of on our list to do some group outreach. So these sessions that we're doing this week is a part of that as well. So we'll go and start and talk about school tours. If we could go, and I should mention that Kenora Parham is here tonight. Sorry, Kenora. And she's helping me with some of the technical stuff. Kenora is the executive director of End Rape on Campus, and she's also running slides tonight, among other things. So she has multiple roles that she's playing all the time. All right, so if we go to the next one, talk a little bit about the group, and we'll talk about why this is important to us. So when we look at studies over time, back in 1987 was the first of these studies that was generally recognized. And this study determined that 1 in 4 women, undergraduate women in the United States, would be sexually assaulted sometime during their 4-year career. Sexually assaulted or sexually harassed, I believe, is the exact terminology. But there have been numerous studies up till late last year. A 2019 Campus Climate Survey basically came up with the same information. 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 women at a undergraduate level in the United States would be sexually abused or harassed during their time. They also gave the information for men. It is a little bit lower, but 1 in 15 men would be either sexually assaulted or harassed during their college experience in the United States. So that's an issue. It is, I would say I'm not a medical doctor, but it sounds like an epidemic to me. Certainly 1 in 4, that's a high percentage of people who are certainly women who are affected by this. So that is certainly a reason to be concerned about this as you're looking for a college for your youngster. So one of the other things that comes into play is the fact that 50% of those sexual assault survivors, and we can go to that next slide, Kenyora, 50% of the sexual assault survivors face institutional betrayal. I read it last night, what the exact definition is. I'm just going to paraphrase tonight. But basically, if you go to an institution or some kind of organization that you normally would trust, whether that be a church, university, police department, prosecuting attorney, the district attorney, or whatever, you would think, well, those are organizations I could trust. They are there to help me, to support me, especially in a sexual assault situation. But the bottom line is at least half the people who went to these, went to various organizations for help found that they didn't get it. In fact, they got more harm than help. So it's important to realize that not everybody's necessarily on your side. So it's good to kind of step into these issues, with the full knowledge of what, what's going on. So we'll talk now about the different aspects of how you can prepare yourself for making a college decision and thinking about sexual assault and that determination. If we go to that next slide there, thank you. And then basically, I set this up as a series of questions that you might ask at different places at different times in the college looking experience. So from your initial contact, which typically maybe you got a letter from a school, or perhaps you have met with a recruiter or a admissions counselor at a college night at your high school or in your area. So you may come into contact with somebody there. So we'll talk about some questions that you might discuss with them regarding sexual assault. And then we'll also talk about, before you go, kind of my mindset here, my paradigm is that people are doing college visits, and realize that doesn't always happen. It takes time and money, but at some point or another, you may be able to talk with a college counselor or college admissions counselor, whether that's a face-to-face meeting as you go on a visit, or whether that's just a phone call. And obviously, so in those three areas, and then we'll talk about the school visit itself or the phone call. There are some questions that deal with that I suggested that you might ask, and you're certainly not limited to these, but these are the ones that I've asked. These are the ones that have been suggested to me by other parents. I even went to my daughter and said, "Hey, what's a question that you would ask about sexual assault if you had a chance to talk to an admissions counselor?" So got these questions from a variety of sources, realizing that most people, I would say probably all people, this is not the number one consideration picking a school, right? Everything comes into play, from the cost. That might be people's number one issue. Obviously, that's a big part of selecting a school. You've got to get in. You need to have a school that's a fit for you and maybe what your career choice is. They've got a good engineering program and you want to be an engineer. They have a good accounting program or a good pre-med program or whatever it is. So somewhere down the list, perhaps is sexual assault. And it's not a bad thing to just interject that into the conversation, if for no other reason than to let them know that you're thinking about this. Let that university know that you're thinking about this. So thinking about that initial contact, some of the questions that you might ask, and I would put questions in two categories. If you've ever done any interviewing, either been interviewed or have interviewed somebody for let's say a job, a hiring interview, there's closed-end questions and open-ended questions. And you can use those same techniques here, right? You can ask the closed-end question: how many people were sexually assaulted on your campus last year? There's a very specific answer. It was 10 or 12 or 15 or 0 or whatever the answer is. Or you can answer ask an open-ended question just to see what they say, how they answer it, what else comes out of their mouth that might be information that's useful to you. So some of the questions I have in that initial contact, and again, it's not the most important thing. It might be pulling the person aside. It might be in a group setting where the person is coming to talk to a group. And if you feel comfortable asking that question of that recruiter or that counselor as they talk to a group, be a good time to do it. So a couple questions there. One, I hear that sexual assault is a significant issue on campuses today. What is your school doing to address sexual assault? So it's a very open-ended question. What is going on? And they can answer that real short, which is kind of an answer in itself, or perhaps they can tell you about what they're doing in terms of prevention, what their honor code is about, what their code of conduct is about, and so on and so forth. So there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer to that question, but if you're looking for information about the way that it's answered and what information they're giving you. If they can't answer it at all, that's kind of telling in itself. Another question, and this will set you up for the next section, is where, most universities, I think all of them at this point have a website and they've got all kind of information out there, right? So what you might ask that individual, so where would I find the student code of conduct on your website? Where would I find information about your adjudication process? So when the adjudication process is, what do we do if somebody violates the student code of conduct? How do we handle that breach? How do we handle that violation? Is there a hearing? Is there an investigation? Who makes a charging decision, and all those kind of things? So that's, you're just saying, not asking you to tell me answer to all those questions, but ask, where can I find that on your website? So the code of conduct itself and the processes that deal with enforcement of that code of conduct. So those are a couple of questions that you might ask, right off the bat, and that'll give you some additional information that you can use to, have a further discussion when you get to the point where you're doing a school visit. From this point, I'm just going to assume we're doing a school visit, but you can ask these questions whenever you have the opportunity to. So before you go, this has to do with school, so I'm going to give you homework. And before you go to school, there are some things that you can look at. So you ask the individual, where can I find information about your code of conduct? Where can I find information about that adjudication process? Go to a website, look it up, see what it says. Is there a definition of what constitutes sexual assault? Are they using words like sexual assault or sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or are they spelling it clearly out? Because it needs to be spelled out. The more detail, the better, because it makes it easier to win a case if it gets to that. So you want to look at that code of conduct. You want to look at the adjudication process, the hearing process, who's involved, if it'll tell you that, what the appeals process is. So glean whatever information you can from that website regarding that code of conduct and again, that adjudication process. A second place that you can go in preparation for the college visit is go to the U.S. Department of Education, and there's a website there that's listed on the screen. Don't worry about copying it. We'll make this available, this presentation available to you. After the presentation tonight, we'll get that sent out, or put it out on a website, I think is what we do. And Kenora is telling me, yes, we'll put it out on the website and you can download that. So you can go to that campus safety and security portion of the Department of Education website, and you can look up Clery reports. So you can get information about how many crimes were committed on campus last year or the year before that. So that would cover all kinds of crime, whether it be a simple assault, whether it be robbery, a burglary, any of those kind of things. And that would include sexual assault. So all those things are broken out in that report. And you can look at the numbers, get some idea what the numbers have been, maybe some idea what the trends are and so forth. So again, you're just kind of getting yourself familiar with the information that's out there and available to you. And that's going to set you up for that school visit when you have another chance to perhaps have a conversation with admissions counselor or whatever. So let's talk about the school visit. And as I was thinking about that, I didn't talk about questions. If you have questions, you can use the chat session to ask questions as you think of them, and then we'll have plenty of time to answer those at the end of the slides. I've got not nearly as much material for those of you who were here last night. I was kind of racing through those slides. We had a lot of stuff going on. Quite a bit less information here tonight honestly, but we should have plenty of time to answer any questions that you have. So if something comes to mind while you're listening to the presentation, go ahead and put that into the chat, and then we'll take those questions at the end. So the school visit, lots of questions could come up in the school visit, and I'll go through some of those and talk about why those may be important. The first, how many sexual assaults currently being investigated? How many Title IX investigators are there at this school? So that kind of one question leads to another. Well, we've got 12 open investigations. How many investigators do you have? Well, one. So you have one person doing all those 12? How long does that take? You know, how long does it take to get an investigation done and a charging done? Is this going to happen while they're while the person is still in school, or you know, is it going to take longer than that? So there's always the follow-ups that can be asked to these questions. Then you would ask them how many sexual assaults were reported in the Clery report. It's okay to ask questions, right? You know, some of you may have an investigative background. It's okay to ask questions that you already know the answer to, right? It'd be interesting to see what they say. So you've gone out to the Department of Education's website and you know the answer is 12, and they're telling you, well, I don't know, I think it's like 2 or 6 or whatever. Or they may say, if they're smart and they don't know, they'll say, I don't know. Keep in mind that this is the admissions counselor, so they may not have these things right at their fingertips. On the other hand, if they do, that information right at hand for them might tell you something that, you know, maybe they're on board with this. Maybe they've really got something going. I found when I asked questions like this, I got about 2 questions into it, and very quickly that admissions counselor is putting her hands up and going, well, I don't know this. I'm going to have to put you in touch with somebody else. I said, well, that's fine. And she took my name and number and had somebody from the Title IX office give me a call. So a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the Title IX office at the school that my daughter eventually did attend. This is the one that I asked a lot of these questions. And I don't think this admissions counselor had ever heard or had these questions asked, because she was kind of pretty quickly taken aback by them. Asked why was I asking these questions. I explained that I fathered 3 daughters, and one of them had been assaulted at another school. So I'm very attuned to the topic, and you know, it's a topic of great concern to me as a parent. So how many sexual assaults were reported last year? Is the trend up or down? So realizing we may be asking these of the counselor, but she may be shuffling you off to somebody else who's got more information about this. But certainly you'd hope that that person would be the right person and have that information at their fingertips. I asked, interestingly enough, in my experience, I asked that person, this is someone in the Title IX office, I said, so how many sexual assaults did you have on campus last year? And her answer was, I don't know. And I was like, really? That's interesting. Do you think you could find that out for me? And she did, and she called me back. But I thought it interesting that somebody in the Title IX office who was giving me as not necessarily the expert, but could answer my questions, didn't know right off the top of her head how many sexual assaults had been reported in their Clery report. And I asked it that specifically. The more detail you ask in your questions, that kind of puts them on notice. Hey, this person knows what they're talking about. I better be on my game here. So that's certainly a question you could ask. How many reports have there been of sexual assault? Is the trend up or down over the last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or whatever it is? Another question that you can ask is, tell me about that adjudication process, right? So the adjudication process is if someone has allegedly violated the school's code of conduct, how does that work? How does the process work? Is there a hearing, as an example? And based on the changes we saw from the Title IX changes in the last week or 10 days that have come out, hearings are beginning to become either mandatory or certainly much more prominent. So a good question is, so if there's a hearing, who's who runs the hearing? Who's in charge of it? Is there a board? How many people are on the board? What experience do they have? Have they been trained at all in how to administer the hearing, especially the person who's the leader? Because you can get some, let's just say, knowledgeable lawyers involved, and they can run roughshod over somebody who doesn't really know what's going on. So it's important that you know a little bit about the hearing, who's on it, what kind of training they had, and again, just see what kind of answers you get from that person at the school. Another thing is in terms of preparation. Most schools these days have some kind of I'll call it indoctrination process. Everything from the various yells at the football games to how to use your meal ticket, and campus safety issues come up as well. So as part of that indoctrination for incoming students, do they talk about sexual assault at all? Did they talk about the student conduct? And do they address the sexual assault component with the students as they're getting their, I'll quit saying indoctrination, their orientation, maybe more polite word. But, it's interesting when I think back to my daughter who was assaulted, and there was a safety briefing at her orientation, but it consisted primarily of saying, don't leave your laptop at the library when you go to use the restroom or go get a snack or whatever. Somebody's going to steal it. Don't be stupid. But that was really it. And, they talked about, is it safe at night and that kind of thing, which kind of suggests they're missing the point, because, the sexual assault, those 1 in 4 numbers, is probably not somebody jumping out of the bushes at night. It's probably somebody that individual knows. And that's, kind of a sad commentary, but that's really it. But in the safety briefing that I heard during the orientation, they didn't talk about sexual assault. They didn't talk about it in the code of conduct. They said there was one, but obviously they're trying to be upbeat and positive and all that sort of thing, but it didn't come up at all. Another question that's important, and this kind of gets to the organization itself. A lot of large universities, some even not so large, have their own police department. So what that means is, I'll just pick on some school. I went to Notre Dame, so Notre Dame doesn't actually have a police department. I believe they're kind of more like security officers. But some schools, they have, let's say, the Notre Dame Police Department, and they're fully certified law enforcement officers. They have the power to investigate, to arrest, and all those kinds of things. So realize, though, it's different when you get a police department that reports up into the institution itself, right? They're taking their direction not from the police chief, but the police chief is taking direction from some level in the university, the senior vice president of administration or some department in there. And there may be a conflict of interest there. So it'd be interesting to know if that police department is an independent police force that belongs to the city or the county where the school resides, or is there an actual campus police department? And when it comes to violations of the student code of conduct, serious violations, they would be the ones who are making that, doing the investigation, potentially, doing a charge or whatever. So for criminal purposes. Couple other things that you might ask in this situation, based on the changes that have occurred in Title IX very recently, realizing we talked a little bit about this last night, but 2,030, 40 some odd pages of documentation was released. I've seen a couple tweets there. Some people have said they read it already. I'm astonished, but there's about 30 pages of rules and like 2,000 pages of commentary. But the bottom line is there's a couple things that you might ask, based on some of what we learned. One is, again, another one of those open-ended questions. How is your school changing its adjudication processes specifically for sexual assault in light of the new Title IX rules? They may not know that answer in the next 4 weeks, but certainly as you move down the road in the fall and you've got a young daughter who's going to school, they ought to have that, pretty well figured out and what the changes are going to be, and they ought to be able to tell you what those changes are going to be. Another question, and this is something that I think Kenora mentioned last night. If not, it was in that session on last Friday that EROC hosted. But is your school taking the religious exemption for Title IX? How will that impact sexual assault investigations and adjudications? That's important because basically, in some ways, some school that's claiming the religious exemption is going to get a pass. And that could mean that somebody who makes a complaint that they've been sexually assaulted, and this has actually happened at a school that I won't name, but the individual was punished for violation of the school code of conduct or honor code for having premarital sex after reporting that a crime had been committed and that this person had been assaulted. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, no matter what my religious beliefs are. If somebody's sexually assaulted, that's against their will. That's not a thing. So again, what is the impact? Is the school claiming the religious exemption? What is the impact on the processes, and how does that work? Obviously, a big state university, that's not going to be a thing that comes into play, but there are a number of schools that, have a religious affiliation, and they can claim that, I believe, even kind of retroactively, right? So there's a sexual assault and they can all of a sudden say, oh, we're claiming the religious privilege or whatever. So that can be an interesting question to see what kind of an answer they get. So those are some of the questions that you could ask. There's plenty more, but you can get the drift of where I'm going with these questions. Every one of these questions, depending on the answer, you could have, a follow-up on them. So, based on the answers that they give, you might say, well, gee, you don't really know that. Is there somebody else who knows that answer to that question? Or have you not figured out, what the changes are to the adjudication process yet? It's the school year starting. These things have to go into effect in mid-August. So haven't you determined what those changes are yet? So again, depending on the answers, there's lots of follow-ups you can do, and you need to be able to listen and then ask further questions. And basically every one of these could have some follow-up for them. So let's talk about what we're going to do with that information. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about what the heck happens. Couple things. One thing that you can do is begin. You don't want to do this for all the schools, but when you're getting down to a couple schools, or perhaps one, your daughter's decided, begin to track their social media, right? Whether that's, that screen there shows some of the things, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm a Twitter user, so I followed my daughter's schools on Twitter, right? And you get some information about, hey, there was a crime committed on this street. My youngest daughter went to a school that was an urban campus, in the middle of a city. And there were crimes that happened around that really had nothing to do with the school, but you're in the middle of the city and there were crimes that happened there. So follow the social media and you'll begin to get a flavor of what's going on, not just sexual assault, but, in terms of what are their newspaper writing about? What are the local media writing about? So, again, begin to follow those accounts. And I would say all of them. If you're not a Facebook user, kind of become a Facebook user, even for that, just even if it's just for that information. Follow Twitter, follow Instagram. There's a number of different things, that are out there. But that begins to give you a feeling for what's going on. The last thing I'm going to talk about is making a decision. So you've got all this information. Like I said, this is probably not your primary motivator. I would hardly think anybody is basing their decision strictly on this. Honestly, if it was, and somebody said, well, what school should I go to? I don't know that anybody could give you a good answer. Who's doing it perfectly well. But somewhere down the list of things, this may be, this may be a topic for consideration. So, obviously you're talking with your son or your daughter, the things that are important to them are going to be, maybe the location of the school. My daughter wanted to go out of state. She wanted a suburban or an urban campus. She didn't want to be out in a quote unquote middle of nowhere. So those were her requirements. And also the lines of study that she wanted to take up. Is this a good school for that, field of study and those kind of things. But somewhere down the list, you're sitting there you're having a conversation with your daughter and you're talking about all the pluses and minuses, and maybe you can't weigh between these two schools and she's having a difficult time making a decision. Well, maybe the sexual assault questions come into play. At that point, it can kind of tip the scales one way or another. Hey, they really had good answers for these questions. Doesn't necessarily make it so. Maybe it means they've studied and they have good answers. But, that may be somewhere well down the list, but at least it's something that could come into play. So it is helpful maybe at some point in making a decision and realizing that your daughter, your son, is the one that's probably got a lot of the decision making in mind. I mean, we certainly didn't enforce much on our kids other than money became a little bit of an issue. So if they said they weren't going to get into Harvard anyway, but they were going to get into Harvard or Stanford or something like that, money might have become a little bit of a concern. So obviously the parents' things weigh into it, but other than that, they pretty much were making their own decisions. But it was a conversation with them, right? It was a conversation about, so what are you looking for? Is this school or that school meeting your requirements? How do you feel about that? So on and so forth. So again, it's making a decision. I would also point out too, that if I had a magic wand and I could control everything, I don't, but if I did, I would make it so that every person who was interviewing admissions counselors was asking these questions, right? If everybody's asking those questions, number one, they're going to figure out, oh, I better get answers to them. And then they're going to report up to the powers that be and say, you know what? People are asking a lot of questions about sexual assault on campus. Are we in the right place? Are we doing the right thing? So like I said, if I had this magic power, I would make everybody ask these sets of questions. And I think it would drive some change on the campuses as it became more and more of a topic that parents were talking about. I think that is all we've got. And I've only used up 35 minutes, so I'm doing pretty good. So at this point, we'll take any questions. So I'm going to get the chat up and see if there's any questions out there. Take a look. So here's one from Nancy. U.S. Department of Education, aren't the number of reports here misleading? Schools don't report their actual numbers. Is this correct? Not the expert on that. The schools are supposed to report actual numbers of reports, right? So it may not be the actual number of assaults, but I believe they can get into trouble if they are not reporting on reports that are made to them, right? So if 10 students make a statement that there was a sexual assault, their number in the Clery report should be 10. Now, there may have been 110 sexual assaults on that campus, but if 100 people didn't report it, their number is going to be 10. So in that sense, it can be misleading. But schools have to report the numbers of assaults that are reported to them. They really don't have any way of knowing, the other information. Kenyora, is that answer suitable? I mean, I think it's correct as it should be in terms of reporting. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also say that because there hasn't been a true kind of enforcement, if you will, of schools not providing and not reporting their numbers, that some of those numbers might be a little off. And even now with the new Title IX regulations may further exacerbate that problem by essentially widening that reporting gap, just due to the stripping of student survivors' rights that these new changes have outlined. And so, if anything, we are asking, like, members of Congress, for instance, to reauthorize the Campus Accountability and Safety Act to kind of, if you will, serve as another safeguard for Title IX regulations, the new ones especially, to help with that reporting measure, and making it be more consistent, more annual, versus, I think, on the campus site here, the campus safety and security site that you provided. I believe this information might be from 2010, if not, actually no, because when we were on it, it was actually like 2018 that you can find information for. So it's still behind, but we're looking to ask folks about, reauthorizing the Campus Accountability and Safety Act to make sure that every year it's consistent. So as people are looking for that new college or university, they can read it on the website and then ask the question just to see if the admissions counselor is on their A game.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, Kinora. So somebody asked a question. I joined last night. You got to hear a bit about your girls. Can you speak to how your survivor daughter chose her second institution? I can, a little bit. And my daughter was out of state, as I talked about last night. She went to a school about 800 miles away. I live near Dallas, Texas. She eventually wanted to be closer to home, not totally surprising, and eventually transferred to Texas A&M, where she graduated last December. Her thought process was, number one, I think, closer to home. Number two, was that did they have a line of study that she was interested in? At that point, she wanted to be a meteorologist. That was what she was studying, and they have a good program at A&M. So it was, I would say, the typical kinds of things that drove her decision. Although she was paying attention to what was going on, and not long after she got there, there was a little bit of I'll say, an awakening there, and some issues came up. Some not necessarily handled in the best way. They kind of corrected that. In the best way, I'm talking about the things that were said, the way they were said, and that sort of thing. But when it came down to it, her decision was pretty much the kind of things that you would expect a child to make a decision on. I think the number one thing for her was she wanted to be close to home, and that, we live near Dallas. College Station, which is where Texas A&M is about 200 miles away. So obviously a lot closer. It's about a 3-hour drive versus where she was before. Next question I see there is, can you think of any schools that have adopted a policy of having an outside body of parents, students, or professionals who provide and perform oversight and vetting of investigative policies and procedures? Honestly, I don't know. Kinora, can you think of anybody that sounds like a lot of forward thinking there. I'd be very surprised if anybody is allowing an outside group to come in and give them their investigative policies and procedures a look at. Now, my guess is they probably have lawyers by the dozen looking at them. But that's, the reason for that is to protect themselves, and excuse the dogs barking in the background. It's feeding time. But Kinora, anything you can add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with you in terms of them trying to protect themselves from parents. I think it's a little different maybe on K through 12 having, parent teacher associations, but in terms of higher education institutions, they'll definitely rely on, their legal counsel for things like that, for sure. And the federal government to help provide some of that oversight as well, or not help in
Like
this.
the way you said that the federal government helps. Yeah, I'm
Not in that,
questioning
not so much.
questioning that in light of the new rules and regs that we saw in the last week or so. Go ahead. Sorry for the commentary.
Oh no, you're fine. No, you're absolutely correct.
All right. Carolyn asks, I'll add that we now ask on college tours, could you please show us the Women and Gender office? Because when a student gets raped, that's where they'll need to go to access services. Tour guides have never included it on our tours. It's not a highlight like other things. University doesn't value it. So that's more a comment. But that may lead to a question. So the Women and Gender office may or may not be the place where they go to access services. It could be different in every school. And one of the things, the changes that's come about because of the new Title IX rules and regs is that there are very specific places that need to go to make a report. I believe the Title IX office is specified, but it may not always be that case. But if you go to the Women and Gender office and that's not on the list, it doesn't count, right? You haven't actually made a report yet. So you got to go to a very specific place. But it's a good question to ask in terms of, so what is the official place that we need to go? And that is kind of an answer to the question of what are the changes that are being implemented based on the new rules and regulations of Title IX. So hopefully that answers the question. We've got a bunch more questions here, so I'm going to look at
I would also add to that question of like, maybe asking the question in your experience, what have you found to be the probably the popular place that students go to where they feel comfortable, and not necessarily about sexual violence, so kind of leading away from it, but just saying like, where do you often see students really congregate? Who do you see them speak to? Which offices? Just to kind of get a feel for even just the culture,
right.
As well. I think would be great.
And that kind of is almost a lead into this next question here. It says, we've also asked how close the local rape crisis center is to campus. Somebody commented on that. I love that idea. I haven't heard of it before. Realized that the Clery Act, we talked a little bit about that last night. One of the things that they are supposed to give you in the Clery Act Bill of Rights is the location and information about counseling. Some schools, the counseling is an in-house type situation. Some may rely on the local rape crisis center. But that's a good question. Who are the supporting or the counseling services that you recommend to people, and how close are they? Are they on campus, or you have to go off campus, and that sort of thing? So the next question, because we have extra time tonight, would you be able to share how your other children are influenced in their choices of colleges? Yep, I can. It was a background. So I only had one daughter who hadn't yet been to college, right? So Maureen is my youngest. Clearly this was a topic. She was familiar with what was going on. She saw the agony that her sister had gone through. When we did a campus visit at the school that she eventually attended, we had talked about it, and I said I was going to ask, but my wife was with us and Maureen, and I kind of shooed them out of the room and said, I want to have this conversation with this admissions counselor. So I didn't do that. I don't know if it was the right thing or the wrong thing, but I didn't do that with them there, but I shared what I learned, which at that point wasn't much, but I shared what I learned when I talked to the Title IX person. Interestingly, think about how I can say this safely. So I haven't said the school that she went to, but we got kind of milquetoast answers to the questions, not surprising. But I later found out through a parent that I was talking to about whose daughter had been sexually assaulted at my daughter's school. And the way they handled it was awful. no way to tell that at the time, but certainly, you know, the milquetoast stuff I heard at when I talked to the Title IX person and the reality on the ground were two totally different things. But when it came down to it, Maureen's choice of college was driven by location, cost, and the program of study that she wanted to follow. That may not be a total answer. We did our best to try and have that conversation, but you know, that was what we did, and whatever. So Ramona said you joined the call late. Chance you've compiled feedback questions you can send out after. We will send a copy of the deck, or make a copy of the deck available on the website, and you get an email on that. Are we recording this one, Kenora? And there'll be a recording as well. So, and somebody answered that. So Kenora already answered that. Sorry. I should have kept reading. Let's see. Some of these are just comments about the other questions. Somebody pointed out less than 10% report campus sexual assaults, according to RAIN, which is an advocate organization and runs hotlines. So higher reporting rates conversely indicate a positive occurrence. My thoughts. I believe the question really has to do with that the rate is going up. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and I would agree with that. You know, if the numbers are historically, let's say 10, 12, 14, 15, you know, for the last 10 years, they've been in the teens, and all of a sudden it jumps up to 50. Does that mean more sexual assaults were occurring? Probably not. It means more are being reported. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So, you know, that it's kind of like the current situation with the pandemic. A lot of governors are saying, well, our cases are going up because we're doing more testing. So the numbers are better, but it's not, you know, it's not a bad thing that the numbers are going up. It's kind of a similar situation. And again, every school is different. When you look at the numbers across the schools, the numbers are really, really low. You look at some giant, you know, state university that's got 30, 40, 50,000 students, and they've got a handful of cases. It just doesn't make sense. So if the numbers go up, not necessarily a bad thing. So your question, go ahead.
I would also say the number may go up, especially if students start to feel even more comfortable reporting, just essentially because survivors, you know, some of them don't report right away. Some of them take days, weeks, months, even years before they come out to share their experience. And sometimes with things like this that's going on, where we, you know, anyway, on campus, PTA, other organizations, like It's On Us and Know Your Nine, where we're, you know, uplifting, you know, what's happening, what's going on, and spreading awareness of this. Sometimes it also allows folks to feel a little bit more courageous to also report and share out, especially if they know other people have gone through it, even on their own respective campuses. So you might see like an uptick from one year in comparison to another, especially just depending on what's going on nationally. So that's another thing too to consider.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Ramona reports, as someone who works at one of those centers that provides services, I would love it if more parents and students asked about us. So, you know, again, if I had that magic wand, everybody would be asking some of these questions, and that would be one of them, right? Again, we're just making the point so that the schools are beginning to understand, hey, this is something that our customers, if you will, because the student and the parents are your customers, they're the ones that are paying the freight. If that's something that they are concerned about, and if that's something that continues to be an issue, you can bet eventually, if the numbers get, you know, big enough that the people are asking about this, that they'll do something about it. Don't know that's going to happen. It's going to take a magic wand probably, but we can always hope. So Ramona mentioned that being a focus of the tour will scare families, but typically it may not be the tour, may not be the right place for that, but certainly orientation, there's usually somewhere in that orientation something about the safety briefing of some kind, right? So, there is a place to do that, although as I mentioned, the school my daughter went to, the safety briefing really talked about being stupid with your PC rather than sexual assault. So, um, valid point. It may scare families. You're trying to sell, not scare. But again, if people are asking more about it, they may need to address it. It's probably not the place for a student who's given a tour, but it's certainly something that the admissions counselor should be able to talk to. All right. How are we doing on time? Check we got about 5 more minutes. Let's see, anything that's a question here. What's the very first thing a victim should do after being assaulted? Then what's the very first thing a parent or guardian should do? Well, the answer to that is it depends. I would say the first thing a survivor should do is make a report, but they may not be in a position where they feel comfortable doing that. And by a report, I mean notifying somebody that a sexual assault has happened. It may not be a complaint yet, where you name the perpetrator and all the details or whatever. But making a report on a college campus triggers some action. So we talked a little bit about this last night. The Clery Act comes into play. The Clery Act has to notify a campus that there's been a sexual assault. The Clery Act requires that you're given information about counselors. Clery Act requires that you are resolving conflicts between the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator or the survivor and shared classes or shared dormitory living and that sort of thing. So to me, that's the first thing a victim should do. Depending on who they talk to, they may get some further advice, quickly talking to a counselor and so on and so forth. You can get into, everybody may not be familiar with the term a SANE exam. SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, and going and getting a physical, and they collect evidence and all that sort of thing. It's an encumbering process. But again, you don't have to go all the way through it. You don't have to say, and I'm going to file a criminal report against this person who assaulted me. But telling somebody something of what's happened, at least kind of get on the record, is important. The very first thing a parent or guardian should do, we talked about that last night. I mean, one, is your child safe, right? Are they physically safe? That's kind of a critical thing. That may last a day or two or a week. And then are they emotionally safe? And that's a question that may come up for weeks, months, or even years. So that's the first thing. When I heard about it, in my experience, and that's not the experience that every parent has, my daughter called the next morning and told my wife, her mother, what had happened. And the first thing we did was talk to her, comfort her, asked her, are you safe? Put her, made sure that a roommate was going to stay with her, somebody who knew what was going on. And then we made some plans to go up there and all those kind of things. So first thing for a parent, child safe, I think is an important thing. And the first thing for a victim is make at least some kind of a report, even if they don't go the whole way. I'd like to report on your thoughts on remote learning, how students should feel about protection during these situations, and the expectation we have as schools with our kids. Are there more or less reasons to feel less safe? That's a loaded question. I think it's probably too early to tell, although one of the changes that has happened with the new rules and regulations that Betsy DeVos is, choosing my words carefully, foisted on us, is that off-campus assaults don't have to be, or are not allowed to be investigated by the institution. So, let's say you're doing distance learning at home and you're involved with another student who goes to the same university, but this assault happens somewhere off campus, that's no longer under the purview of the university. It could be a civil matter, criminal matter, but it's not something for the school to take up. So are there more or less reasons to feel less safe? I think the new rules and regs have kind of taken away some options. We went through a lot of different things that you could do last night. One of them was making a complaint about a code of conduct violation. I think distance learning, you get off campus and all of a sudden that's not an option any longer. Kenora, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I would also say that despite the virtual learning, because there are some schools that are also might be doing a hybrid version of some on campus, some online, whereas some schools are completely reverting to online. Um, Two things I want to mention is that there is a provision in there in terms of online harassment. That if that occurs, that is something that schools have to abide by. I would have to get clarification if it would still apply, since technically if it occurs off campus, would it still follow underneath the Title IX regulation? So we can always get back to you on that piece. But with regard to the other point is also with regard to off campus, they've now included any off campus event that is essentially sanctioned by the school and deemed as an educational activity or program. So that also includes fraternity and sorority events where the fraternity and sorority are recognized by the school. So as long as the entity, this fraternity or sorority, is recognized by the school and a sexual assault occurs on a sponsor, like a school-sponsored event or program or activity, yeah, I don't know why I can't talk tonight. Essentially, it falls underneath the Title IX provisions for the school to then, move forward with investigating. However, let's say a sexual assault occurs directly across the street from the campus, and that has nothing to do with the campus. The school can't do anything. And if a sexual assault occurs with a student from a different college, the school is also not obligated to follow Title IX either.
You got to realize too that universities right now are probably in turmoil. They're trying to figure out, are they even going to have classes in August, face-to-face classes like traditional? Are they going to have to continue to do, distance learning? They've got, new freshmen coming in. How do you do orientation and all these different things? These are things that would be going on, now or coming up. So they've got to get all that sorted out. And in the meantime, they've gotten, 2,000 pages of rules, really 30 pages of rules and regulations on them, and they've got to get that sorted out as well. So there's some busy bees on campus right now, and they're, working through that. All right, I think we are out of questions, and I see 7:01. So I'm going to thank all of you for attending. Thanks for giving up some of your time today. Stay safe. Hopefully you learned something. If you want to get in touch with me, we have a website, our organization, PTAEROC.org, and you can send an email. It'll get to me or one of our other parents. And you can also call the number 877-782-3762, which is 877-PTA-EROC in shorthand. And basically, that'll come directly to my phone when you press 1, unless I'm really busy doing something, cleaning the pool or whatever. But you can leave a message, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. So we can talk further if you have some issues or other questions. I would also point out that on Thursday we're going to do what we call a parents panel. So myself and Gary Lee is one of the other dads. We'll basically be on Zoom for an hour, just taking questions from parents and anybody. So we'll spend an hour talking about whatever anybody wants to talk about. So thanks for listening in this evening. I appreciate your time. Stay safe and stay healthy, everybody. Thank you.